The latest from one of our Rat Pack tonight, Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez with an announcement surprisingly out of character after 7 years of support for FARC, that's the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. Chavez now calls for the rebels to lay down their arms and to release the 700 hostages it holds. Is this a new Chavez? Maybe next he'll let Exxon back in to straighten out his oil fields. Well, Charles Roth oversees Latin American coverage for Dow Jones Newswires, and Thor Halvorssen is founder of the Human Rights Foundation and a friend of Scoreboard. So, Charles, first to you, this announcement, we should say, maybe because of what I'm going to say, was preceded by the discovery of one of Chavez's right-hand men in the military being caught red-handed with just tons and tons of weaponry over the weekend, right?
Well, that's true. It was also preceded by the discovery of computers in a FARC camp in Ecuador.
Now, that happened about a month ago after one of the FARC leaders, I think the second in command, was killed in a raid across the border in Ecuador, just across the border.
By Colombian.
But Thor, this weapons cache that was discovered that's the man, by the way, who was killed about a month ago, whose computer file led to a wealth of information about the connection between Chavez and FARC, but also this weapons cache made that connection as well.
Yeah, well, it's more of the same. This is not the first time that the Chavez government has been caught with its hand in the cookie jar. They're constantly being caught with weapons. The Colombians have been catching Venezuelan weaponry in the hands of the FARC now for years and years. Everybody knows that this is the case. It's just that it's very difficult for the U.S. government and for many European governments to admit that this is actually happening because of the consequences. They're addicted to this oil. They're not willing to take the step and say, okay, Venezuela is a state sponsor of terrorism. What are we going to do? In the absence of saying, okay, let's declare them that, well, why don't they go after the Venezuelan ministers, starting with the first minister of the Interior, Ignacio Arcaya, and ending with the current minister of Justice?
You say go after. You mean in terms of literally arrest these people the way we did with Manuel Noriega?
They should be wanted throughout the world. These people are financing one of the bloodiest terrorist organizations in the world. The reality is Colombia has been ripped apart for 40 years by these terrorists, and you have all of these Venezuelan ministers who have visas to the U.S. They spend weekends in Paris. They go to Vegas. There have been tons of Venezuelan ministers that go to Vegas to spend the money they've stolen.
But, Charles, history is filled of deals being made with bad people, and Chavez clearly is one of those bad people who is now presenting a deal to the world, saying, I can get the FARC guerrillas to agree to certain conditions that might get them to lay down their arms. Should we take Chavez, as much as we dislike him and distrust him, should we take him at his word on this point, or at least use him to broker some kind of peace deal?
I don't know that we can, because it's unclear just how much control Chavez has over the FARC. I mean, the FARC has seen its military command tremendously eroded in recent months. 3 of 7 leaders are gone. They're dead. And it's essentially degenerating into a organization that is less controlled by what was a centralized command, but had, operationally speaking, decentralized execution in its units. So just how much control Chavez will have over this trend that has really been propelled not by Venezuela, but by Colombian military forces. The reason why the FARC's on the ropes is because of Colombia's military.
So Thor, is this just a case of Chavez trying to throw us off scent, which is his connection with the FARC?
Always. Chavez is constantly saying one thing and doing another. He uses the word peace like it was a grammar. Every comma and every period is peace, peace, peace. We cannot take him at his word. Every time that he expresses himself, whether it's with regard to the FARC being his sister organization, he says that he wants to recognize him. He is now calling for the FARC to release the prisoners. Now, if the FARC releases these hostages, it means that they are open as a military target for the Colombian government to go after these terrorists. So that is not going to happen.
That, by the way, is one of the women, a Colombian woman, Betancourt, who was kidnapped 6 years ago, I believe, has been kept. There is another person, another prisoner, I believe, of the FARC as well. They've kidnapped thousands of people.
They keep them in cages.
And keep them in cages in the jungle.
And they keep them in cages as human shields. You see, the Muslim terrorists are suicide terrorists.
These are Americans right now that we're looking at. Go ahead.
The terrorists of the FARC want to take control of Colombia by force. They say so. And they want to install a dictatorship. This is one of the organizations that most violates human rights in the Western Hemisphere. And Chavez is simply trying to cover up the fact that he has been caught, as Charles so accurately pointed out, with all of these files linking him, financing, giving them weaponry, and so on.
But let's bring it to business, Charles, because one of the things that may be happening here is that Chavez may be desperate. There are a number of areas, despite all of the billions of petrodollars he has, his company, the company that his government owns, the oil company, is in terrible shape. It's been mismanaged terribly. He fired all of the expert managers and put his cronies in years ago and continues to do that. So is it possible that he really needs help now in order to get his affairs back in order?
PDVSA is still making billions and billions of dollars.
PDVSA is the Venezuelan oil
company that still produces, according to industry sources, about 2.5 million barrels of oil a day, and exports perhaps 1 million barrels of that, maybe 1.5 million. It's hard to know because internal consumption has increased dramatically, but some 10% of U.S. imports come from Venezuela.
Yeah.
And Venezuela exports about 2/3 of its oil to the U.S.
Clearly it's pumping this stuff out, but Thor, they have made some terrible they have mismanaged the company terribly.
Yes. They fired 20,000 of their executives. PDVSA used to be a meritocracy. They fired 20,000 people, in the process, in some cases, dragging people out of their homes on the oil fields, and they replaced them with a bunch of inept people. They've had, in terms of environmental disasters, several equivalents of Exxon Valdez in Venezuela that everyone has ignored.
Yeah.
Venezuela keeps...
For anybody who's against drilling in Anwar, by the way, they should see the beautiful areas of Venezuela that have been destroyed for years, decades to come, because of the terrible way the oil's been pumped.
It's a scandal that's been covered up very accurately, and they prevent flyovers over certain regions because they do not want people to see the oil damage.
But, Charles, we had Rex Tillerson, who was the chief executive of ExxonMobil, say that one of the reasons the price of oil is so high is because of mismanagement in countries like Venezuela. And he says we urge governments of the countries that have resources to allow us, meaning Exxon, to develop them. Just a signal that such success will be granted would have an immediate effect on the market. In other words, the price. Is there any chance at all? Every energy nationalism is a move in exactly the wrong direction. So is there any chance that Chavez might eventually allow American oil companies back into Venezuela to start pumping more efficiently?
Well, I think so. Chevron and other major private sector oil companies, Total, Statoil, they're still in Venezuela. Exxon is not. ConocoPhillips is also contesting last year's nationalization of its assets. But as Venezuela's production encounters more obstacles, Chavez may decide that he needs the foreign help. So, yes, it's possible.
So, Thor, when do you think that might happen?
I disagree with Charles. The reality is Chavez would rather have a badly functioning oil company that he has full control over and can use all of the wealth that comes from there than have a world-class oil company that pumps what it used to pump before he came into power. This is affecting the world economy everywhere. The reality is if Venezuela was producing what it was producing before he came into power, when oil was at $10 a barrel, it would be a very different scenario. And he needs that oil. He doesn't care. As long as he can control PDVSA, he is going to stay in power and have enough money to bribe his way through the OAS, the UN, and all of internal parts of Venezuela.
Charles, we should also mention that a lot of other nationalized oil companies, like Russia Oil Company, for example, are also mismanaged, and any attempt to make them a little better organized has fallen by the wayside because of the thirst for power by the politicians in charge.
Well, I think these things come and go in cycles. As countries realize that their national companies are underexploiting their resources, they invite people back. Venezuela nationalized in 1976, invited foreign oil companies back in the 1990s, and now we're seeing nationalization again. It's hard to believe that
So these things go in cycles.
they seem to, yes.